Can we all just take a moment to acknowledge how genuinely insane it is that it's taken until now for Zelda to get her own canonical game? Like, I can't believe it took nearly 40 years for a series called The Legend of Zelda to actually have its namesake finally be the protagonist in one of the games. Heck, Peach got her first game nearly 20 years before Zelda did. This was long overdue. Now, having said that, I am so happy we finally got an entirely new 2D Zelda game that isn't a remake or spin-off title after so long. It's been nearly 11 years since A Link Between Worlds came out, and while the remake for Link's Awakening did help fill the 2D void in my heart, I've been wanting something wholly new for a long while now. And let me tell ya, Echoes of Wisdom more than delivers on that front. The fact that you're not playing as Link this time around by itself already made this easily the most unique 2D Zelda game to date, but it also takes some inspiration from the open world titles, and honestly, I love that. There are a lot of really cool ideas in Echoes of Wisdom, including some things I'd actually love to see the open world games take note of. But more importantly, like I said a moment ago, this is the first time Zelda's gotten a game to herself that's not the CDI games. There's definitely some room for improvement here and there, but on the whole, the talented folks over at Grezzo did a really great job, and honestly, I just really want to talk about it. So join me while I tell you all about Echoes of Wisdom, a legend nearly 40 years in the making. The game starts with this era's Link working his way through Ganon's lair to save Zelda and defeat everyone's favorite pig demon, which wouldn't have been too out of the ordinary if it wasn't for the rift in reality that randomly opens up after he beats Ganon. While it does ultimately swallow him up, he does manage to save Zelda before falling in completely, with Zelda managing to escape Ganon's lair before the approaching rift gets her too. She's not out of the woods yet though, because after returning to Hyrule Castle and telling her father, as well as the general and minister, a rift opens up in the throne room that takes the three of them and spits out evil copies who blame everything on Zelda. Zelda does manage to escape prison though with the help of Tri, a small yellow spirit who gives her the Tri-Rod, which has the power to create copies of things and creatures he calls Echoes. Tri himself is a member of a race of spirits whose job is to mend the rifts that have occasionally popped up in the world since the dawn of time. But not only have the rifts increased in frequency and severity lately, all of Tri's friends have gone missing too, with them being trapped inside the still world, the void all of the rifts lead to. So with his help, Zelda sets off to clear her name by fixing the rifts across Hyrule and finding her lost father as well as Link, all the while helping the various other races of Hyrule in the process. While Echoes of Wisdom's actual story isn't anything too crazy by Zelda standards, barring the fact that Zelda's the main character this time around, I did still enjoy it. All of the stories leading up to each dungeon were, at the very least, nice, with Holy Mount Lanayru's being my favorite because Conde is just the most wholesome buddy. My second favorite would have to go to the Goron story, though. Darston's struggle growing into his own and finding his own path as the new chief was something that, for very different reasons, I kinda related to. Frankly, Darston's just one of my favorite characters in the story. On a bit of a different note though, I was a little surprised by what they did with Link in this game, because he physically can't talk here. Due to a traumatic event when he was younger involving the rifts, he completely lost the ability to talk, so for the first time in the series, he's canonically mute. I did figure this would happen eventually in the series, so long as they kept making him a silent protagonist, but I wasn't expecting the first time to be in a game where he isn't even playable at all, beyond the opening. But hey, still cool that it happened. Honestly, I kinda hope they explore this idea more in future games. Unfortunately though, beyond all of that, I don't really have much more to say in regards to Echoes of Wisdom's actual story. Don't get me wrong, like I said before, it's fun and definitely charming. It's just that as far as the game's actual plot is concerned, it's on the more simple side of things this time around, which for me is perfectly fine. Sometimes all you really need is a fun and simpler story. The lore, on the other hand, though, is a totally different story. For spoiler reasons, I can't go into the specifics, but I will say that the lore and history surrounding the rifts as well as Tri is very interesting and just as cool. I can't say anything more about it than that, though, so I'll just say that on the whole, I really enjoyed the story Echoes of Wisdom told. It was a nice and fun little adventure that I'm sure has made the lore community and theorists very happy. Now, having said that, as far as the presentation goes, Echoes of Wisdom carries over the art style from Link's Awakening, and I'm all the happier for it, cause let me tell ya, I love how adorably chibi everyone is. In all seriousness though, the game does look really good. Hyrule on the whole looks really nice, the still world is surprisingly pretty for an interdimensional void, and the chibi art style really does add a lot of charm to the game, just like it did in Link's Awakening. As for the music though, I thought it was pretty good. The soundtrack has some pretty nice renditions of older songs like Hyrule Field as well as Kakariko Village, but the new bits of music are of course just as good. Now, having said all of that, I want to finally get into Echoes of Wisdom's gameplay, because with the game mechanically revolving around Zelda and not Link this time around, it's a fairly different beast compared to every other 2D Zelda game. When it comes to fighting, Zelda's got a spin for getting around faster, dodging, and cutting grass somehow, but aside from swordsman mode, more on that later, that's about it. Instead, Zelda has to rely on the echoes she can create with the Tri-Rod for combat, puzzle solving, and especially getting around, with each echo costing a certain amount of triangles to create, a pool that'll expand as you play the game. New echoes can be obtained by copying certain objects as well as by defeating enemies for the first time and copying the little version of themselves they leave behind. Having now said all of this, let me just say that I really like the Echo system. They help highlight in gameplay the fact that Zelda's always been associated with wisdom in the series, with it giving the game a much higher emphasis on puzzle solving as well as creativity. And even if I did default to using some echoes more than others, it does give you a lot of meaningful ways you can approach combat and even exploration, with there being 127 different echoes in the game. As for some of my favorites, I really liked using the P-Hat for the early game, since it's great for effortlessly mowing down weaker enemies. And these little armadillo dudes were great for quick damage since they come out swinging when summoned. Honestly though, as a quick tip, I would say to make a note of really any echo that comes out swinging. It can help speed up combat a bit. I also liked using the Moblins. They made for mostly reliable foot soldiers when I needed them, but when I needed some ranged attackers, the game's Octoroks made for some nice sentry turrets, though they can struggle with hitting enemies in the air if you're not carrying them. There's also a bunch of automaton monsters you can get from Dampé, but unfortunately I both learned about and unlocked these so late into the game I actually can't comment on them all that much, but for what it's worth, I do like them as an idea as well as their designs. Really, it's a neat mechanic in general for a game like this. Now, having said all of that, I'd be remiss for not mentioning the UI for the echoes, because people are understandably annoyed by this. The game handles the menus for this like how Tears of the Kingdom handled fuses, and while I'm not personally bothered by this, I can't disagree that this wasn't a good way to handle the echoes menu. On a different note though, echoes aren't the only ability the Tri-Rod gives Zelda, because by binding Tri to objects and even monsters, Zelda can effortlessly move them while she herself is moving. Honestly, while I really liked Bind, there's not much for me to comment on here. It's used in some nice ways for puzzle solving and really helped complete Zelda's toolkit, but that's about all I've got to say on it. When it comes to combat though, and occasionally exploration, Zelda does have one more thing in her arsenal with Swordsman mode. About halfway through the first dungeon, Zelda finds Link's blade, the Sword of Might, and when using it she can temporarily change forms to use it, with how long being determined by the energy gauge. Over time, you'll also find the bow as well as Bombs of Might, and all of them along with your max energy can be upgraded at Luberry's house with Might Crystals, which can be obtained by fixing rifts and exploring Hyrule. As a little bonus, Swordsman mode also has a higher jump for when you need that extra boost for making certain jumps, which is just nice. Swordsman mode for me is a really fun and pretty welcome addition when it comes to the combat side of things in Echoes of Wisdom, because without it, I feel like the combat parts of the game would be a lot more divisive and really just more of a turnoff for people. I mean, let me tell ya, this is a Zelda title that has a bit of a slower and more methodical pacing compared to the other games thanks to the emphasis on using the echoes. And with just your summons, there are some fights that as a whole would just be less fun for some people. On an unrelated note though, I want to get into some of the other new things the game does, starting with the smoothies. There are a few different spots in the game where you can find a Deku Scrub that'll make smoothies for you by combining 2 ingredients you've bought or found while exploring. Depending on what you use, these can heal you, restore your energy, give you buffs, and in many cases, all 3, with you only being able to hold a max of 20 at once, which means it's pretty much a more limited version of the open world game's healing. It does also negate any reason to buy red potions after the first dungeon in my opinion, cause why would you spend 30 rupees for 5 hearts of healing when you can spend 10 for way more and still have tons of ingredients left over, but honestly that's more of a nitpick for me than anything. If I did have any criticisms for it though, even if this one didn't bother me on a personal level at all, I do think it's a bit silly how I can only make 1 smoothie at a time and I always have to watch the dude make them. Like, I'm functionally just buying them from a shop but with extra steps. There's really no reason I shouldn't be able to just make them in bulk and move on. Moving on though, Echoes of Wisdom also introduces accessories to the main series, and honestly I really hope these become a mainstay going forward. Zelda can equip a limited number of these at a time, with that limit being increased by paying the Great Fairy to up your style, with it capping out at 5 slots. Each accessory will give Zelda some kind of meaningful buff, like increased money and heart drop rate, a higher jump, etc. A few of them can be bought from shops, but the majority of accessories you'll get will be from side quests as well as exploring the world. And while some of them are better than others, as a whole they make for a great addition to the game. Aside from just being really fun and neat rewards, I think they add a nice bit of variety to the kind of things you can actually earn or find while exploring, especially in this game, where most of what you're finding is just money or ingredients, and it's an idea I think future open world Zeldas would really benefit from experimenting with. And actually, on a similar note, can we talk about how cool it is that Echoes of Wisdom has a bunch of optional side dungeons complete with their own relatively unique bosses? Like, honestly, I was not expecting to see something like this here, but I'm all the happier for it because I've been wanting the games to do this since Breath of the Wild. And the best part is that they're all pretty good on the whole. Out of all of them, I liked the Rex ship the most, with it having my personal favorite aesthetic and it also having my favorite boss out of the 4, but the other 3 certainly aren't bad at all. I will say though, I wasn't too big a fan of the fights with Smog. It could very easily just be a skill issue, but I didn't enjoy whenever you would have to put him back together at the end of each phase. It was honestly just kind of annoying for me. Now, as far as the main dungeons go though, I really enjoyed them for the most part. Each dungeon takes place in the Still World, with your goal being to beat the boss at the end to free Tri's friends and fix the rift that dungeon's in. Just like in the open world games though, there's not a totally definitive order for what dungeons you should do and when, but unlike those games, you can't do all of them at the start. The first, fourth, and final dungeons all have to be exclusively done in that order, with you having the freedom to do everything in between in whatever order you want. This time around, with the sort of exception of Jabul Ruins, the dungeons don't follow Breath of the Wild's terminal structure, and instead have you trying to get the big key to open the boss door. But just like those, there's no real dungeon item, with all of the puzzles revolving around your use of Bind and the Echoes. Out of every dungeon in the game, my personal favorites would definitely have to go to Lanayru and Faron Temple. Aside from having some of my favorite dungeon build-up and just a really nice and relaxing theme, I really like the fan-related puzzles in Lanayru Temple. Freezing and unfreezing the rooms with these orbs was a really cool idea that felt kinda like a mechanic you would see in the open world games, and honestly it made me wish the other dungeons played around with stuff like this more. Faron Temple though I really liked because of just how complex it is. Just like Skull Woods, it has multiple different entrances you'll need to go into, with some of the rooms being completely isolated from other parts of the temple. I also liked what they did with the boss key though, in that you're having to actively hunt it down, with Manhandla having snagged the chest it's in. Honestly, it was a pretty cool way of shaking things up for me. Now, having said that, I do have some criticisms for the game's dungeons, all of which can be summed up with, I feel like they could have done more with some of them. Like with the game having an emphasis on creativity and mechanics like the Echoes as well as Bind, you'd think the dungeons on the whole would capitalize on that more, but outside of the 2 I mentioned previously, a good few of them are surprisingly simple, even compared to other 2D Zeldas. Like, genuinely everything else but the dungeons are usually great. The bosses are really good, the atmosphere, music, and aesthetics for them, with a couple of exceptions, are great. It's that when it comes to the gameplay, I think some of them are a bit lacking for me. Really though, despite my criticisms, if you weren't a fan of how the open world games handled their dungeons, I can say with complete certainty that you'll like Echoes of Wisdoms more. And honestly, you very well may not even take issue with some of my criticisms anyway. These are just my own thoughts and opinions at the end of the day. That being said, there is one unforgivable thing wrong with Echoes of Wisdom though. Something that truly baffles me. Why can't I pet the kitties? Like, in all honesty, I am partly joking here, but as a lover of dogs and cats, it does bother me that every major, entirely new Zelda game since Breath of the Wild has lacked the ability to pet the furry friends, and I'd really like to know why Nintendo hasn't given us that ability to do so yet. On the whole, I'd say Zelda's first canon adventure was a really good time, and as someone who's been wanting an entirely new 2D Zelda game for a while now, I'd say it was well worth the wait, though hopefully it won't take so long to get the next one. While the actual story wasn't anything too crazy, the new lore and history we got was really interesting. And for what it's worth, the individual stories for each of the dungeons were pretty fun and charming, and honestly, like I said, sometimes that's all you really need. Gameplay-wise, I really loved a lot of the new ideas here. The Echoes were really fun and interesting to fight and explore with, and despite my issues, I did genuinely enjoy all of the dungeons. And I think for anyone who hasn't been a fan of more recent ones will really like these. Beyond that though, I really hope things like the optional side dungeons, I guess you could call them, and at the very least the accessories become a mainstay for every future Zelda game, especially the open world ones. Honestly though, Echoes of Wisdom also makes me hope we get more games starring Zelda in the future, or at the very least having her be playable or a part of the mechanics somehow in one of Link's adventures. Like, she's the namesake of this franchise. I don't think people will disagree with me when I say that she's earned the right for this to become a more regular thing by this point. That being said though, thank you all for watching, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I hope you all have a nice day.